So we're very happy to start the afternoon session today with Anastasia Volovich from Brown University. So thanks for agreeing to speak here today.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, hi. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to give a talk. I really wish I could come in person. I was actually planning to come in person, but there are circumstances that prevented me from doing so. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the recent developments in n=4 super young Mills scattering amplitudes. And this is work based on this papers that are written here. That's together with Mark Spradlin, our current postdoc, Akshay Yelishpur Srikant, former student of NEMA, my former student Anders Schreiber, who is now postdoc at Oxford, and two of my current students, Jorge Margo, who is actually graduating this year, and third-year student Li Chen Ren. Very good. So the subject of this talk is planar n=4 super young Mills amplitudes. So these objects have been computed to a very high loop order. And there are kind of two reasons why they're interesting. So first of all, they have a lot of remarkable properties, and many mathematicians working in combinatorics, algebraic geometry, and number theory are interested, or many of them have been working on various aspects relevant to scattering amplitudes. So these are really interesting mathematical structures that emerge from the study of these scattering amplitudes. On the other hand, the methods that have been developed for this n=4 young Mills theory are either directly applicable or also not just directly applicable, also have greatly helped actual QCD computations. So when phenomenologists and collider physicists do this standard model computations, the same types of integrals that, for example, they have to do. And the methods that have been developed for example, for doing these integrals, the integrals are simpler in n=4. And of course, the methods that have been developed for n=4 are very, very relevant there. And they've been applied to a more realistic situations relevant to QCD. So this is not just some toy model that we're studying. These are actually useful for practical purposes on one hand, and on the other hand, they have remarkable interest in formal community and from the point of view of mathematicians. So this is the outline of my talk. So I'm going to have like a slide for a status of these computations. Then I'm going to have a slide of methods of just tell you a little bit how these amplitudes are now computed, and then quickly show you a couple of tools that are relevant. So the focus of my talk today will be the singularities of these amplitudes. So there are a lot of work that has been done and various directions one can go, but today I'll stay focused on just the singularities of these amplitudes. You can ask, okay, you're just talking about singularities, what about the whole functions? That's later on, but that's not, there's a lot of work on that, but I'm not going to talk about that today. So what I'll do, I'll survey known singularities and try to understand mathematical structures of those singularities. So I'll start increasing the number of points in those amplitudes, and I'll review for you that for 6 and 7 points, the singularities could be described by cluster algebras. That's a subject that's studied extensively by mathematicians in the past 20 years. And then when we start going to high number of points for 8 and 9 points, I'll explain to you that new features beyond cluster algebras start appearing and new methods and tools would be needed. And so I'll review some of the other people's work using Polytops and tropical geometry to study these singularities at 8 and 9 points, and conclude with some of our recent work trying to understand these singularities from Plaby graphs and from tensor diagrams. Okay, any questions or no? Okay, so as promised, let me just start with one slide summary of the status of these amplitudes. So, okay, so the amplitudes are characterized by the number of points and number of loops. Okay, so if we look at 4, so the simplest ones we can look at is 4 and 5 points. So for n equals 4, they've been known to all loop orders due to the work of Baron, Dixon, and Smirnov in 2005, and that's known something like BDS ansatz. So you can write a formula that 4 and 5 point amplitudes are basically exponents of one loop amplitude. So these are very well understood. So the focus in the past decade or so has been mostly on going beyond 4 and 5. So the most non-trivial amplitude starts at 6 points, and these have been computed through 7 loops. And so I refer you to this nice review by Karen Hood, Dixon, Drummond, and others, surveying. So it's a nice review explaining all the methods. So, but the upshot of this is that 6 and 7 points have been computed, 6 through 7 loops, and 7 points through 4 loops. Okay, so let's start increasing the number of points further. So MHV amplitude, so these amplitudes are characterized by positive or negative helicity gluons. When you have 2 negative helicity gluons, these are called MHV. When you have 3 negative helicity gluons, these are called NMHV. So for all n, MHV are known through 2 loops, and they've been known for decades. And so interesting recent progress came from the work by Song Hee and his student and postdoc, where they were able to compute some new amplitudes. For example, for 8 and 9 points, they were able to get NMHV through 2 loops. And very recently, 2 weeks ago, 8 points MHV has been computed through 3 loops. And I'll tell you some of the new features that rise. So it took a decade to move to the next step, and I try to explain why. Okay, so now let me explain to you how these computations are done to the such a high loop order. So this is known as something called Amplitudes Bootstrap. So obviously these computations are not done by evaluating some of this high loop diagram. So what one does, first knowing the singularity. So first of all, one needs to know the singularity structure of the amplitudes. Then, based on the singularity structure, you write down an answer as a linear combination of functions. And based on some physical properties, you know what kind of functions to put. And all you have to do, you have to find the coefficients in front of these functions by solving a system of linear constraints. Okay, so it's easy to say this, but in practice, so for example, I have the table here listing the number of parameters, listing the number of constraints in this linear system. So for example, if you go to 6 loop, 6 point amplitude, you start with some kind of ansatz, which involves, over 3,000 of parameters. So you have to solve, 3,000, a linear system with over 3,000 parameters. But now you start imposing various symmetry constraints. So you say, before you solve it, you say, okay, I know from symmetry such and such things should be appearing. Then there's something called final entry condition. There's collinear limit. There's multi-radial kinematics constraint, and you keep going and apply these constraints. And what is remarkable is that at the end they're able to find a unique solution. So it's a very highly constrained system. And the unique solution exists, and that's how they are able to compute these scattering amplitudes. Okay, so, and again, there's a nice review that I already mentioned by, most of the work has been done by Dixon with various collaborators of his. So I refer you to this review. Okay, very good. So now the tools. So what are some of the tools that we used? Again, this is going to be like not very technical, just very vague. So first of all, let's think of these amplitudes as some function of some variables. Okay, so we can ask a question: what kind of functions would appear. So because we're talking about n equals 4, it is known that MHV and NMHV loop amplitudes can be expressed in terms of just multiple polylogarithm functions, and the weight of that polylog is equal to twice the number of loops. So for example, if you're interested in 2 loop amplitude, these are weight 4 polylogs, like, log to the 4th of Li4 would be examples of weight for functions. Now so the function now, what are these amplitudes the functions of? Well, the arguments of these functions are also something very special, and they of course encode the location of singularities. So I'm not explaining this in detail, but this is so the singularities are certain letters, and we call them symbol alphabet. So sometimes I use word singularity, sometimes I use the word symbol alphabet. So normally, okay, what kind of arguments do you have in the functions? So normally you have, the amplitude is a function of momentum. So very crucially, for n equals 4, you have to, instead of using momentum, you use momentum twisters. So again, I'm not going to give you a full introduction. I'm just going to say that what you do is in each point, you, instead of P1, P2, P3, P4, P5, P6 for 6 points, you associate to it a line and twistor space. So you would have Z1 where each Z2, etc., where each Z is in P3. Now, n equals 4 Yang-Mills theory has this nice symmetry called dual conformal symmetry, which is just SL4C. So given these Z's, you can write down a natural SL4Z invariant. So these you organize these Z's into a 4x4 matrix and take its determinant. So everywhere from now on, I will be having these brackets. So this is nothing but the determinant of these 4 of these Z's. So I'll have examples of different amplitudes on the next slide momentarily. So these are some general things I wanted to mention. So now let me get a little bit more focused and tell you what's known about the singularities or symbol alphabet for known amplitudes. So again, a lot of things are known. I will just tell you what do we know. Okay, so let's start with 6. Okay, so if you remember, if I want to talk about 6.2 loop amplitude, that would be a polylog function of weight 4. So the amplitude is like Li4 of various brackets that I had on the previous slide, and they will look like something like this. And then you can ask a question: what is the different set of brackets that appears? And it turns out all that could appear for 6 points are just the Pluka coordinates on P3, okay? And there are 15 of those. So, and they're of the form, the brackets are always like 1, 2, and then the other BC could be anything. So in other words, the singularities for 6-point amplitudes are described by these 15 letters. So that's the result from 2 loops. Now, when the Bootstrap people are computing the high loop amplitudes, they start with these 15 letters and they start bootstrapping. So it's very, very important to know what the singularities are. Now we go increase the number of points. So there are the computations at 2 loops were done about a decade ago by Simon Caron-Huot. So the structure of the amplitude is that there's a more complicated, so it's 2 loops still weight 4. There's a more complicated polylog Li2, and then if you look at what appears in the arguments of that Li2, in addition to Pluka coordinates on for 7 points, there are 35 of them of the same type as I had for 6 points. So A plus 1 BC. There are also this funny quadratic expressions in Pluka coordinates that start appearing. So in total, there are 49 letters So 35 Plukers plus 7 plus 7 of these types. Okay, so we keep going. It gets complicated as you increase the number of points. So for example, for 8 points, this has been computed last year. So you have some Pluker coordinates, and then you have some expressions which are quadratic or cubic in those Pluker coordinates. And I just surveyed for you on just take it as a data from Amplitudes. So what we will be doing, we'll be trying to explain this from some modern mathematics. And so they're rational expressions, so quadratic and cubic. And then there are also what is interesting, that various algebraic letters start appearing. So there will be expressions involving the square root of this complicated object that I've written downstairs, plus some cyclic of that. Okay, and then you can say, okay, so that's 2 loops. Now, recently, if you go to 3 but stay at 8 points, there are more and more letters. So as they new computation are being done, there's additional 24 letters that's been computed about 2 weeks ago. Okay, and the only last one example that is known would be the 9 points. Again, so I just, as a survey, I've written down what the singularities are for the 9-point amplitudes. You see, again, the structure, becomes more and more complicated. But again, you have the 2 classes of expressions. So something quadratic and cubic in Plukers, so we call them rational letters. So 531 of those, and 99 letters that contain square roots. Okay, so that's the data from Amplitudes. Okay, so somebody did the hard work for us. Now, what we'd like, so this is a theory we really like. N equals 4 Young-Mills theory. So what we'd like to say is, how do we, okay, so this is a list, nice, but if we would like to have some kind of structure or understanding of this list. So what is the mathematical description of the singularities is the question that I would like to focus on. So how do you describe this mathematically? So like, what are those produced lists? And indeed, for 6 and 7 points, before the new data at 8 and 9 came up, we observed that the singularities are given by the subset of cluster coordinates of the Grassmannian cluster algebra. So these in particular.
I had a question.
Yes.
So imagine that you fix, let's say, 6-point amplitude, but you want to study higher loops, so 3, 4, 5 loops. Is it clear how many letters do we have?
Yes, so the Dixon et al., they computed it up to 7 for 6 and up to 4 so for 6 points up to 7 loops, and for 7 points up to 4 loops. They start with these.
Okay,
so they start with 15 and 49, yeah.
But do they know, for instance, that they are not missing parts of the symbol which are constructed with letters they haven't considered?
That's right. That's right. So it is an input for them. So there have been some consistency checks, and it's remarkable. But it's remarkable that there exists a unique solution comparable, which satisfies all constraints. But yeah, it's an assumption in the Bootstrap. I have to say. I mean, some computations have been done explicitly. Some 3-loop computations have been done using Wilson loops, but the Bootstrap program of Dixon certainly is based on this being an input. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so far the Bootstrap has been done for 6 and 7, and no Bootstrap has been done for 8 and 9. That's why, again, I'm coming to this. Okay, so very good. So we'd like to know what is the mathematical description of the singularity, and we observe that I will show in the next slide that at least at 6 and 7 points, these could be described by cluster algebras. So let me have my slide on a cluster algebra. So what is that? So cluster algebras are defined by 2 things. You need to specify an initial quiver and a mutation rule. So if I'm interested in a GR for n, the initial quiver looks like the way, is it a question? Is
Yeah,
something?
sorry to interrupt. Maybe the volume was a little soft. Sorry. Just to make sure I understood. So is the list of letters a pure mathematics question, or it's a question of what combinations appear as singularities in the amplitudes? It's kind of a
So for our purposes, list of letters have been computed from amplitudes, and we would like to find a mathematical description of them.
okay. I see. So it's kind of, so the definition of a letter is it's a combination which is, you know, dual conformal invariant that happens to appear in the physical n equals 4.
Exactly. So when I list this list, an 8 and 9 points, I cite Songhee. So they've done the actual computation of an amplitudes, and that's a result.
Right. I see. Okay. So, but there's not like some a priori mathematical definition.
No. So let's just do, so there are various problems we could solve. So let's try to focus on this. So from amplitude side, the results for the amplitudes have been computed using various methods. So we'd like to now, we take this list as a given and we try to see the structure. Can we say something? What, yeah, can we describe it mathematically? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, good. So, good. So for 6 and 7 points, the answer to this question will turn out to be cluster algebras. So to define, again, the cluster algebras, you have to start with initial quiver and specify certain mutation rules. So the initial quiver is for GR4N is written on the slide, and given the various arrows, you can produce various cluster coordinates by certain mutation rules. Again, the cluster algebra is a subject in mathematics active in the past 20 years. The best reference, I think, is just a Google cluster algebra portal, and every single conference class and anything written would appear there. And they were invented by Fomin and Zelevinsky in 2002. Now, okay, so let's try to do this. So that's a general definition of GR4N. So forget about amplitudes, just take that definition and apply it for 6 and 7 points. So the quivers for 6 and 7 points look like that, the way I've drawn here. So using the mutation rule that I have on the previous slide, you go ahead and you produce all the other cluster coordinates. Okay, so for example, if you start with this and mutate on node 1, 2, 4, 5, you produce this quiver and you produce the new coordinates 1, 3, 5, 6, which did not appear on the previous slide. So, and you continue. So what happens is for 6 points, you get 14 of those quivers. For 7 points, you get 833 quivers. And the set of coordinate, different cluster coordinates that would appear would be exactly 15 for 6 points and 49 for 7 points. So, and this construction exactly matches the amplitudes results that I presented on this slide. Okay, so very nice and very nice. So we have a description of the singularities for 6 and 7 points. We say they're described by cluster algebras. Okay, and this would have been nice except for 2 things. So it's known that starting at 8 points, the number of cluster coordinates become infinite. So here you see there are only 15, and here there are only 49 for 6 and 7, and it becomes becomes infinite. So in fact, there's a theorem by Fomin and Zelevinsky. It turns out if you can mutate the quiver such that the quiver looks like ADE Dinkin diagram, then the number of cluster variables is finite. So for 4 and 8, one can play a little bit and see that it's not, you don't get the Dinkin diagram. So, okay, so that's one issue. The second issue is that, as you saw, and I mean, this has been anticipated from various discussions before, the explicit calculations, but if you remember the data from amplitudes, you see that for 8 and 9 points, the letters involve square roots. Okay, so that's also not something that appears in cluster algebra. So we need to understand these new features, and we'd like to understand what is the object that could describe those. Okay, so and that brings me to some of the recent work. So there's been several approaches to this problem. So I listed 5. I'm going to quickly have a slide on 1 and 2, and then review a little bit about our work 3 and 4. Now, when do I have to stop? when do I have to stop?
I think
Hello?
it would normally be 35 minutes plus 10 questions, which would bring us to about 5 to 10 minutes from
10
now.
minutes. Okay, cool. All right. Okay, so then I'll do this quickly. So so there's been several approaches trying to understand this. So approach number one is based on, so I'll have a quickly flash a slide for each. So a tropical geometry approach. So the idea is the following. So again, this has been developed by Spear and Lauren Williams in 2003, where they were able to associate a fan to a positive Grassmannian by solving tropicalized Pluker relations. So you look at, so these Pluker coordinates are based on relations, and you tropicalize them and associate a fan to it. Now, then what Drummond et al. Did, they didn't look at tropicalization of Pluker relations. They looked at some smaller version. Okay, so some particular coordinates they would tropicalize, constructed the fan, and it turns out that the rays, the fan has 272 rays, and those rays are G vectors for cluster coordinates that exactly reproduce these letters. So it's a very sophisticated mathematics. So, but from this tropical geometry construction, they're able to get this list and more and that's been done now for 8 and 9 points. And then there's also some exceptional rays, and they're able from that to generate square roots. Okay, I'll just leave it at that. Then there's approach of dual polytops by Arkani Hamed et al., where they looked at something dual to these fans, and they used the work of these mathematicians, Chang Duan, Fraser, and Lee, to compute the variables associated to some exceptional rays. And they resummed them and found that they didn't find exactly the letters that appear, the square root letters. They found that when they did some estimation, whatever appears in the pole has exactly the type of square root that appears in the amplitude side. Now, let me just briefly flash some of our approach. So we've been trying to generate these letters from Plabic graphs. So again, I repeat for you. So we have these two lists. So whatever we do should reproduce 6 and 7, obviously. But what we're really after is reproducing 8 and 9 points data. Okay, so Plabic graphs have been extensively used in amplitudes, and particularly for integrands. So for example, you look and there's a Nima's book on that. Now, what we are doing, we actually looking at final expressions for the integral. So it's not like we're just looking at integrands. And so the idea is that if you start with some Plabic graph and solve some delta function constraints. So Plabic graph comes with a certain matrix C, which parameterizes the cell and some positive Grassmannian. Then you solve CZ equals 0, and then you compare with known singularities from the amplitude side. So it's a very, it's very easy to say, but it requires some mathematica. Okay, but very easy to formulate, a question which is very easy to formulate. So, we draw some Plabic graph, solve CZ equals 0, and boom, we get the letter. So here I drawn, so before we do anything, we reproduce 6 and 7. So I just drawn for you a graph. And then we continue for 8 and 9. So the two things we have to do. So first we have to figure out the square roots. And yes, indeed. So for 8 points, we exactly get this square root. For 9 points, actually we get square roots plus more. So nobody knows at this point. It could be that there are more square roots beyond what appears at 2 loops. And then there was interesting results. Also, you have to get rational letters. And there we have to consider something like non-Plabic C matrices, where we, for example, if this is a graph, you can mutate on one of the faces. And then there's some subtleties that sometimes solution involve non-plastic coordinates. So in particular, we proved that restricting to certain top cells, so this C has K and N in it. So when K is N minus 4, so you look at particular graphs, you can start with that top cell, perform the sequence of mutation, and exactly get the alphabet rational letters for 8 and 9 points. So this mathematical constructions of Plabic graphs precisely reproduces these two lists. Okay, so there are lots of questions, of course, remain. So what we're kind of doing is we're doing some kind of phenomenology. We don't have a theory or to explain the pattern. You know, how do you associate each graph to which letter? So we're really doing, you know, here's my list. I did try this, I get this, and I try this other graph, I don't get it. So how do I go around it? So what we've done so far, we identified a set of graphs that reproduce all known 8 and 9 symbol letters. And of course, you know, eventually we want to solve all n. So a lot more work would be needed, and a lot work would be required on both sides, on amplitude side and on the Plaby graphs side. So, and then let me quickly flash my second approach. So the second approach, again, we took something essentially from cluster algebra literature that's been extensively used and applied it. So there is something called tensor diagrams, which mathematicians discuss. So yeah, I don't know how much. Maybe I'll just quickly flash that these were constructed by Fomin and Pilavsky in 2016. You know, you color boundary vertices black, and then they have the valence 4 for GR for n. And to each diagram, you associate, so for each outside vertex, for each outside line, you associate a momentum twistor Z, and then you contract, depending on how the diagram looks like, you contract them with epsilon symbols, and you generate, to each diagram, there's associated invariant. So for example, here is just 1, 2, 3, 4. Here it gets more complicated. So again, these are objects studied by mathematicians. And then these tensor invariants are invariant under some graphical moves called Skein relations. I don't want to go into detail, just present them. And essentially the main statement is the following. So you take a web, which is a planar tensor diagram, and then you take an uprisable web, which is a web that can be turned into a tree diagram using this Skein relation. So for example, I drawn here a tensor diagram. Using Skein relations, you can turn it into something like that. And then tensor invariance, the statement is that tensor invariance for an uprisable web are in one-to-one correspondence with cluster variables. And that's the main conjecture by Fomin and Pilavsky. So what we've done, we looked at the almost uprisable webs. So we suggested that we'd like to look at the tensor diagrams which have one inner loop, okay? So could be reduced, but one loop remains. Then we assign to them something called web series. So we said we have some kind of rule how to assign it to them, and then we sum that series. And in the pole, in the resulting expressions, in the poles of that expression, the square roots that appear for 8 and 9 point amplitudes appear. So for example, you know, for this graphs, the series takes some form, and you see there are two poles, and this exactly matches the square roots. Okay, so that's basically the upshot of the construction. It's very, because it's very technical, so I try to simplify it as much as I can. So now I will conclude. Good. So I've talked to you about n equals 4 super Yang-Mills amplitudes. I showed to you that for 6 and 7 points, the singularities of these amplitudes are described by GR for n cluster algebras. Then I told you that starting at 8 points, one needs a mechanism producing two things, producing finite subsets of GR4 n, because the cluster algebras becomes infinite dimensional, and also one needs a mechanism to produce square roots. So there have been several approaches to this problem: tropical geometry, Plaby graphs, and we studied, we invented two of them, Plaby graphs and tensor diagrams, and we were able to reproduce from these approaches, we were able to reproduce the existing data from the actual amplitudes computations. So a lot more work in future should be done. So again, There's some subtleties more systematically. Some of the Plabby graph construction should be studied. More examples should be worked out on both sides, both on amplitudes and on Plabby graphs. Of course, I also only focus here on singularities. Then there's a whole machinery, how to write down the cluster functions from these letters. And for example, then there's certain properties such as cluster adjacency, which are related to Steinman relations. So lots of very interesting results there. So none of that has been yet applied for 8 and 9 points. And eventually, of course, this is n equals 4 Young-Mills theory. Eventually, we want to go beyond that. And for example, in the recent work by Johannes Henn and collaborators, they showed that cluster algebra is useful just for pure integrals without restricting to n equals 4. So C2, for example, and that's relevant for the integrals, for some of the collider physics integrals. So a lot, it would be interesting to generalize some of these approaches for non-n equals 4 Young-Mills theory examples. Yeah, with that, I'll stop.
Thank you very much for the nice talk. Do we have any questions from the in-person or remote audience?
Hi, is there an understanding of these singularities in terms of some Landau diagrams?
Yeah, that's actually our previous work. So for a couple years ago, yes, there is an I should have mentioned that. Yes, there is. We've looked at solving Landau equations, maybe starting with 2016 paper. Yes, and moreover, we also then looked from amplitude side deriving these things. Yeah, there are papers on that. Yeah.
And so all of them can be understood.
Yeah. In fact, some of these things were predicted from that analysis of amplitude and Landau. Yeah. So yeah, there are papers on that. I should have mentioned that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. One more question here. One more.
So I found the part about the tensor diagram, etc., interesting. So you have this non-averagable, etc. So does that mean that you go beyond the cluster algebras and talk about some object which is not cluster algebra? Is that true?
Yeah, the square roots are not cluster coordinates, right? So.
Right. But then is the connection to quivers or this particular mutation rules, etc. There is no known counterpart for these objects. Yeah,
so cluster algebra for Min-Pilevsky conjecture is for aberrizable, right? So those correspond, the invariants are exactly cluster coordinates. Now we need, right? So that's a statement. So for aberrizable, you get cluster coordinates. So we need to produce square roots. So there hasn't been any, as far as I know, constructions in math literature. So we just said, okay, why don't we take an almost aberrizable with one loop and see what we get. So it's really, but the way we were doing it, we wanted to produce the square root. So that's why we made it up. So.
I see. So then you have other sections like a non-Plabby diagrams, etc. How is that discussion related to this tensor diagram discussion?
Yeah, so exactly. So I should have mentioned that on the list of open questions. I think it's an interesting complementary approach. So the way we do it so far, that's a complementary approaches to the same question. So can we get this from Plabby graphs? Can we get it from tensor diagrams? And we try to reproduce the alphabet that appears on amplitude side. But certainly, I think it would be interesting to understand this in more details, because there should be eventually some relations, because just like with tropical geometry, this is some polytop and dual polytop. Here I don't have an understanding yet, but this is something we're thinking about.
I see. So what's known so far is that some variables arise from two different ways, but it's not known whether one contains the other, one approach contains the other, or.
No, every approach, for example, for 8 points, every approach reproduces the same list. So, for example, for rational letters, it's 180, and actually it's 200. There's some other ones. So there's a big list, and each approach reproduces exactly this list, if you want.
Actually, I have a small follow-up question. Is the statement that all invariants that come from, say, the tensor diagrams with a single loop then correspond to a letter that appears in some amplitude? Or?
No. These are only, so the, you're talking about almost stabilizable. The almost stabilizable are only for the square. So almost stabilizable is a construction that we actually came up with only to get the square roots.
But I meant, like, does every almost aberrizable tensor diagram give you an object that then appears in an amplitude, or it's some...
Yes. I mean, for 8 and 9, we didn't analyze further.
Okay, I see. Thanks. Yeah. Any other questions, or any questions from the remote audience? If not, let's thank Anastasia Volovich again.
Thank you.